In Sucker Punch Studios' Ghost of Tsushima from 2020, you take the role of the samurai Jin Sakai during a Mongol invasion of the island of Tsushima. Your job is to push back the invasion and free the island. And to do so, you utilize one of video game character's primary abilities: murder. The enemies you fight in the game can be categorized into two main groups. On one hand, you have the Mongol soldiers and other groups fighting for them, and on the other hand, you have bandits. Apart from some variation in their armaments and fighting techniques, these two groups are, from a gameplay perspective, identical. Both soldiers and bandits are enemies, plain and simple. You can either choose to sneak up on them and kill them before they see you, engage them in combat directly, or some combination of the two. Outside of scripted sequences, there is no way for you to interact with them that does not involve violent conflict. This is not uncommon for a game. Games tend to divide all non-playable characters into two general groups: friends and enemies, with a possible third group that is neutral. Regardless of how characters are then placed into factions narratively, the game mechanically rarely cares about anything other than whether a character is red, green, or possibly blue on the minimap. And why not? It works! Bandit or soldier, what does it matter? The important thing is that it is an enemy to be defeated. But the thing about the word bandit is that it's just a charmingly old-fashioned word for criminal. And generally, we do not sort invading soldiers and ordinary criminals into the same group. Hopefully, we see them as two very distinct categories. As a society, we have decided that there is such a big difference between them that completely separate laws apply, something that is more or less true all over the world and throughout much of our history, including in feudal Japan.
Enough!
And this makes it kinda remarkable that they are, by you in the role of Jin Sakai, treated as equals. Especially since Jin, to some extent, acts as an arm of the state apparatus. In his role as samurai, he is a kind of combined police officer, soldier, and politician. He is part of the nobility that largely determines the country's laws, and he's also the one who punishes those who violate them with the full power of the military.
The worst one can do is take advantage of their own people.
The worst thing you can do is take advantage of your own people, says Jin Sakai, missing the irony of him being a literal nobleman. The game does its best to get around this little issue by constantly insisting that the bandits are really just the worst, just absolute shit dicks. Terrible people whom there is absolutely no reason to feel sympathy for. These are not people driven to a life of crime by underlying circumstances that could possibly be related to the power structure Jin is helping maintain. They are just animated by an irresistible passion for doing crime.
I almost feel guilty about it.
No, you don't.
You're right, I don't.
They won't just steal your rice, they can't help but also murder your whole entire family. In short, these are people who deserve to die, is what the game, probably to some extent inadvertently, suggests. Ghost of Tsushima is not without its moral quandaries, but the question of whether it's ethical to kill criminals is not something Sucker Punch really wants to touch on. They're willing to go so far as to discuss whether chemical warfare might maybe be a bit problematic, but they don't want to raise questions that risk making it less fun to run around hacking people to pieces. One of the greatest distinguishing factors between criminals and enemy soldiers in the real world is that one of the roles, enemy soldier, is much more clear and less ambiguous, because unlike most criminals, enemy soldiers self-identify. The presumption of innocence, the notion that everyone is to be considered innocent until proven guilty, is a well-known cornerstone of many legal systems and a pretty good rule of thumb in general. If a person hasn't committed a crime, that person cannot be considered a criminal, and as long as we don't know that someone has committed a crime, we have to assume that they haven't. Whether you take on the role of a criminal as soon as you commit a crime, or if you do so only when you are caught, is a distinction that ultimately comes down to how we view the role itself. Do we see it as socially constructed or objective and absolute, albeit defined through a socially constructed set of rules? And I believe the answer to which perspective is correct is context dependent. Sometimes when talking about a criminal, it is relevant whether they assume the social role and experience the social consequences of being a criminal, and sometimes it's only relevant whether or not they have committed a crime. So for this video, you will just have to accept my oversimplification when I say that you don't become a criminal until you've committed a crime, as opposed to enemy soldiers who do not need to have actually engaged in any soldiering to be classified as enemy soldiers. All that is needed is that they meet the twin criteria, being part of an army in a country that is at war. I want to be very careful with my words here so as not to talk about such a complex subject with too sweeping a language. For example, I have a little sloppily used invading soldier and enemy soldier as synonyms, which of course they are not. All invading soldiers may be enemy soldiers, but not all enemy soldiers invade. When I say that enemy soldier is a role with fewer gray areas than criminal, I am also exclusively talking about the platonic ideals of the roles. Soldier as defined by a dictionary, or perhaps a video game, far from the muddy complexities of the real world. In reality's anemic shades of grey, it is often difficult to make all of the necessary distinctions, and over the years many people have been identified as enemy soldiers and killed with questionable justification. There are, of course, laws specifically written to clarify whether or not someone is an enemy soldier. But the system is at best a gentleman's agreement between people who are okay with people dying, but don't want it getting too crazy. A system that will always favor those with the most power, since they are the only ones with the ability to ensure that crimes are actually prosecuted, and that will always only judge individuals and not the system that created them. Soldiers who can only be said to have chosen to put their lives on the line for their country if we ignore the economic reality and the ever-present military propaganda permeating the fabric of our society. But in this discussion, in order for us to move forward, I will now, after several caveats, still postulate that existing laws for war are valid despite surrounding complexities. The law will, in this case, be considered an extension of the general opinion, and the law presents a definition of an enemy soldier and the scenarios in which it's okay to kill that soldier, and that list is far more expansive than the list of acceptable murder scenarios for criminals. In addition to the fundamental problem of implicitly advocating for the implementation of a curbside death penalty,
Delivering justice in the open.
Ghost of Tsushima's treatment of criminals also creates a ludonarrative issue. As I said, mechanically the bandits function exactly the same as the soldiers, which means that Jin Sakai almost always knows that the bandits are bandits mechanically before he knows it narratively. Even before Jin sees the bandits actually commit crimes, the game's mechanics inform us that they are criminals through the ways the game lets us interact with them. As a player, you can always immediately identify a group of strangers as bandits and start killing them indiscriminately. With the exception of some barbaric cultures like the capitalist semi-theocracy that is the United States of America, killing civilians is not allowed outside of some very extreme circumstances, usually related to the danger of another party, as that would be classified as self-defense. And if Jin Sakai approaches any of Ghost of Tsushima's many bandits, they will immediately attack, which means that it's okay for Jin to defend himself. The problem, as mentioned, is that the bandits are seen as enemies mechanically even before they've started attacking, or for that matter committed any known crime, and that it is therefore possible, and even rewarded, to attack first. Which in the game's fiction means that Jin Sakai, a wealthy aristocrat and elite soldier, steps up to a group of strangers, draws his sword, and attacks. If this went to trial, I don't know if I like Mr. Sakai's case. In 2009, Batman Arkham Asylum introduced to the world a mechanic that would soon take the entire gaming industry by storm: Batvision. With the press of a button, you activated a function in Batman's visor that gave you a tactical overview of the room you were in. Suddenly, you could see through walls, notice interactive objects, and clearly identify your enemies. This was a very convenient feature, as it allowed developers to use more realistic graphics, with mechanical elements being less telegraphed, since they had an alternative method of conveying that information. Narratively, however, it creates problems. Sure, I can absolutely buy that Batman has advanced techno-magic that allows him to see through walls. But what is the data used to separate villains from ordinary people, something the visor can apparently do instantaneously? In the Arkham games, the developers have consistently used a very handy approach, placing Batman inside some sort of prison surrounded by almost exclusively criminals, which removes much of the ambiguity from most situations. However, there are still people in the prison who are not criminals, and a lot of criminals who are not actively committing crimes, yet Batman always manages to figure out who's who. One could argue that the villains in the series make it easy for him by often dressing in clothes that directly signal their loyalty to one of the game's major villains. But beating someone's ass solely based on them wearing gang colors feels like a dangerous precedent to set. Personally, I don't think he was wearing a crime sweater is an argument that should hold up in court. Batvision proved to be such a useful game mechanic that it started being introduced in games left and right, regardless of whether there was a reasonable narrative explanation or not. Suddenly, ordinary people could roll their eyes into the backs of their heads and see straight through concrete walls. Tom Clancy's The Division gives us a version of Batvision that overall feels very believable. I completely accept that super-strapped sci-fi soldiers have Google Maps beaming straight into their faces. But here as well, the implementation raises some narrative questions. The narrative in The Division is perhaps a little, let's call it, questionable in general. In the game, you are part of a special division in the US military whose job it is to keep society in check when shit hits the fan and the government collapses. And to do this, you are given total freedom to murder pretty much anyone you think needs murdering.
We have no rules. We have no limits. Our job is to protect what remains.
Rarely have Tom Clancy's personal politics been more prominent in a game bearing his name. The good guys must be allowed to shoot the bad guys to save the world. But what is even more remarkable is that their Batvision can immediately identify who is a civilian and who is, well, also a civilian, but bad, and needs to be shot. Despite this reasonably being one of the most complex determinations for a soldier in this position. A small tangent. In the Insomniac Spider-Man games, the unnamed New Yorkers are referred to as civilians, which they obviously are. However, in the games, this is presented in contrast to the criminals that Spider-Man fights against, even though they are also, by definition, civilians. Of course, Spider-Man doesn't kill anyone in the game's fiction, but the game still classifies people who break the law as the opposite of civilians, which I guess means that they should be seen as military targets? It's incredibly unclear what data the visor in The Division uses to determine a person's status. It's clear that it's not based on what they're doing in the moment, as you can come across people marked in red who are mostly just doing nothing. I guess that they could have been identified against a central database of known criminals, but given that the government has collapsed, that seems unlikely. And even if that was the case, it would still mean that on-site capital punishment is considered a reasonable response to past crimes. The only conclusion I can draw is that it must be something about their actual physical person that allows the visor to identify them. It can't be as simple as whether they have a weapon or not. This is the US we're talking about. Everyone has guns, and this is precisely the type of situation they've been told that they need them for. Even the game's blue-collared good guys often have weapons. So what remains is more or less what the person looks and dresses like. And the enemies in The Division certainly dress in a specific fashion. So, from a purely storytelling perspective, what's happening is that a group of super soldiers open fire on a group of people just standing around because they've identified them as threats based on them wearing hoodies. The Division was released in 2016. I can imagine a counter-argument saying that the people who were shot actually are bad guys, and if they'd seen you first, they would have opened fire. We know this because it's a video game, that's how it's programmed. But that's precisely my point. We only know this because we are aware that we're playing a game and have knowledge that is not part of the story. If we read the game solely based on its narrative, then that's irrelevant. This brings up another distinct difference between criminals and soldiers. Soldiers wear uniforms. In a war, the two teams run around in their respective jerseys to keep track of who's on their side. But as a side effect, this also informs the opposing team of who they're supposed to be shooting at. Again, in reality, it's not quite that straightforward, but this is the general idea of how war, quote-unquote, is supposed to work, and how it's most often represented in games. This has no real equivalent for criminals. There is no dress code, no symbol, no secret sign. To know if someone is a criminal, you either have to witness them committing a crime or know their personal history to some extent, which obviously isn't the case in these games. That the criminals are criminals is the first thing we know about them, just like if they were a group of enemy soldiers we spotted. They're red on the map, time to shoot. And even though the fact it's like this is a result of decisions made regarding game design rather than about narrative, it becomes a part of the game's story. It becomes a part of a worldview that's presented. The game's ideology.
The name of this trash can is ideology.
What it boils down to is how one answers the question, is a criminal someone who does crimes, or are crimes something that criminals do? It may sound like a strange distinction, as logically, if one is true, then the other must be as well. But it's a question of perspective. Either we see a criminal as an ordinary person who has committed a crime. No more, no less. That they're a criminal means only that they've committed a crime and doesn't necessarily say anything specific about their character. Alternatively, we see criminal as something one is, a character trait that some people just have. A criminal is a person of a certain type, and people of that type will inevitably commit crimes. This is a worldview that is very convenient for people whose empathy doesn't extend to people under radically different circumstances. They can't empathize with another person's life story to the extent that they can understand why someone would choose to break the law, and instead have to create a completely separate class of people. A them to their us, so that they don't have to try to figure out why some people end up in criminality. The answer is that they're criminals, that's why they started committing crimes. Even though only people pretty far out in the far right would fully admit that they think some people are natural criminals, the underlying mentality is shockingly pervasive across a large portion of the political spectrum. If you follow an ideology predicated on the idea that we live in a meritocracy and that structural injustices don't exist to its logical endpoint, the only explanation for why some people are worse off than others is that they're worse people. Dumber, lazier, more prone to committing crimes. Because we live in a society that is heavily segregated along racial lines, this mentality also contributes to a racist worldview. If you don't accept structural racism as a force shaping people's lives, then you must find another explanation for why poverty, marginalization, and crimes are more common in some groups than others. And that explanation becomes, stated or not, that certain types of people are inferior to others. This way of explaining the world is also very politically convenient. If you see inequality as naturally occurring, then it is easier to argue that there is no need for change. That some people are rich and others are poor is because that's what those people deserve. The rich have worked hard, the poor have not. And you can completely ignore the complicated realities behind crime. The fact that research says that the only way to reduce levels of crime is to implement prevention measures that take into account that crime does not occur in a vacuum doesn't matter. It's trumped by your knowledge that criminals are people with poor morals, poor character, who need to be punished. Structural explanations and solutions are seen as coddling these criminals. What we really need is to be tough on crime. And if your only plan for stopping crime is being tough, then the definition of criminal that only includes those who have committed crimes, or worse yet, only those who have been convicted of committing crimes, becomes problematic. This means that your solution can always only be implemented after a crime has been committed. You can't punish as a preemptive measure. But if instead you operate on a definition that says that criminal is something a person just is on some fundamental level, then you can get around that problem. You no longer need to wait for an actual crime to be committed to start punishing. You can punish people as soon as you see them. And this is the view of crime that many games, consciously or not, present. As a result of a quirk in how game designers often choose to build enemy NPCs, the narrative takes the ideological position that a criminal is something that certain people just are, and that that type of person does not deserve our empathy. This might be the result of very deliberate decisions by developers wanting to present this worldview, but at the risk of sounding naive, I believe a more likely explanation is that this is the result of developers not thinking about it really at all. Ghost of Tsushima makes two half-hearted attempts at overcoming with narrative the issues that the game's mechanics have created. Two attempts to approach these issues that both ultimately end up exacerbating the problems as they highlight their existence in all other parts of the game. The first, broader way the game tries is with the character Yuna. She saves Jin's life early on in the game and becomes a close ally, first due to common interest and later through mutual respect. She is also a thief, a criminal, something that makes her dishonorable in the eyes of the samurai. It may not be explicitly stated that she is a murderer before the start of the game, unlike many of the bandits, but given her background and the ease with which she kills characters to help Jin, it is not entirely unlikely that she may have killed people in the past.
We can get close, slit their throats, and kill them without a sound.
Besides, it's not like Jin seems to really care if the bandits he kills have actually committed murder. My point is, legally, Yuna has the same basic status as the bandits. But throughout the game, Jin learns to see her perspective and will come to her defense when talking to other samurai, which immediately complicates the narrative. If there are good criminals, that means we can't just assume that someone is evil because they are a criminal. If there are circumstances that make it morally justifiable to commit a crime, how can we be sure that all the other criminals we encounter deserve to die? However, the game never really expands this into a full coherent argument. Instead, the resulting logic is that the actions Yuna has performed are okay in her case, but would have been immoral if they were performed by someone else. Or again, that it's not committing crimes that make someone a criminal, but something deeper. Being a bandit is something one is, and not really related to what one does. And if someone who isn't a bandit happens to break the law, that doesn't really count. The second attempt that is made is more direct, and in that way probably worse, despite being a much smaller part of the game. In the side quest, A Debt Repaid, Jin comes across a bandit surrounded by other dead bandits. His first reaction is, of course, to get ready to kill this person without much thought.
Stay still. I can end your suffering.
But after the bandit tells him that he was actually forced into the bandit life against his will, Jin realizes that this bandit is not a real bandit and therefore does not deserve to die. He then goes and kills each and every other bandit in the gang so that the person who was forced to become a bandit can return to his life. And at no point in this quest does Jin stop to consider that if one person in the gang was forced there, maybe the same thing applies to other bandits, whether by direct threat or by circumstance. He learns that a person who, by all appearances, was a bandit, was not, in fact, actually a real bandit, and that doesn't cause him to pause for a second before killing every other bandit in the same gang. So in the end, the argument being made is never one should not indiscriminately kill criminals, but rather these specific characters turned out not to be actual criminals. And perhaps equally bad, they don't seem to place much or really any importance on ensuring that a person they are going to kill really is a real criminal, regardless of definition. Jin realizes that one of the people he thought was okay to kill was not in fact okay to kill, and he learns from that nothing at all about the need for some sort of process that determines someone's guilt that goes beyond what he personally believes.
Those bandits have earned death.
I liked Ghost of Tsushima. I liked Batman and Spider-Man. I even thought The Division was pretty fun. So I'm not saying that these are game-breaking issues that make the games bad or problematic. I just haven't been able to stop thinking about how video games relate to guilt and crime since I played The Division in 2016 in the midst of the raging Black Lives Matter movement. I've been trying to write this script ever since, but I've always had a hard time finding a good angle. It's a somewhat esoteric exercise to discuss the moral implications of who you are allowed to kill in video games. I mean, it's generally agreed that pretty much all murder is bad, and the amount of murder committed in video games is absolutely insane. If someone in real life had killed as many people as an average video game character does, there would be no doubt about them being an absolute monster, regardless of their motivations. There is no way to morally justify a person committing hundreds of murders. And this is a problem that mainstream narrative games almost always face to some extent. The three most fundamental mechanics in video games are walking, jumping, and murder. So in the majority of games, if you want to tell a story, it has to be a story that involves a lot of murder. Games aren't entirely alone in this. The average movie character also kills more than the average person in the real world, but that difference is much smaller than the one between movies and games. There is a greater proportion of movies without killing than there is games without killing, and few movie characters kill to the same extent as a video game character. For a simple comparison, let's look at a movie character and a game character in the same genre. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones kills 9 people. That's quite a few people for a person to kill, definitely. But let's contrast that with a game character who took clear inspiration from Indy.
Nope. Bad dates.
In the first Uncharted game, Nathan Drake manages to kill somewhere around 1,100 people. Then when Nathan Drake got his own movie, those 1,100 people instead became 4, none of whom is killed in as direct a way as being shot with a gun.
Oh my god, I'm so sorry!
This isn't as much of a problem when you're making a game with a greater degree of abstraction, where perhaps the game part of the game is not meant to be read as a 100% literal representation of the story. But the medium of games has evolved, and now developers want to tell more realistic human stories. And when the main gameplay mechanic still involves murder, they have to create realistic human stories that include a lot of murder, which requires a realistic human way of creating hordes of characters who deserve to die. That's why many games choose to focus on an inhuman enemy, such as monsters, demons, robots, aliens, or Nazis. Sure, you can't completely discount the possibility that there are reasons to sympathize with an alien, after all they can have just as much consciousness and feelings as a human, but it still feels a little better to shoot a Guga from outer space. But that also becomes limiting after a while. Not all games can be about World War II or alien invasions. Many can, absolutely, but not all. Sometimes you just want to tell a story where the enemies are both human and not Nazis. So how do you go about that? In The Last of Us Part 2, Naughty Dog chose to lean all the way into the problem and delivered a game where you were forced to fully empathize with your enemies. But that's a difficult balancing act to pull off, and not even they manage to hit the mark all of the time. So instead, developers often choose to go the other way and put as little thought into the issue as possible. Which is how we get a Jin Sakai who mows down hordes of criminals with murderous mania in his eyes.
Don't kill me!
If a game has a story and what you do in the game is part of that story, then the game's mechanics will be more than just mechanical. They will be part of the narrative. You can't develop game and story separately and just stick them together at the end, and you can't implement mechanics on a whim without thinking about their implications. Or, well, you can, obviously. You can go on right ahead if that's what you want. It can apparently result in pretty decent games anyway. But it will also leave the game just that little bit worse than it could have been.
They look like bandits before. What have I done?
Four months later, this video is finally translated. Good job, me. I can finally put this project behind me and move on to something new. If you like this video, please do the YouTube things and share it and all that. I put a lot of effort into these videos and would appreciate it if more people saw them. Thank you and goodbye.